The stakes on climate change just simply couldn't be any higher than they are right now.
Our customers are demanding that we step up and show responsibility to them and to the planet.
There's this big opportunity that hasn't been filled to really build outstanding private companies that make a difference in climate change.
Welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist at the Post. We're kicking off a new series for Washington Post Live called Protecting Our Planet. And today our first guest is Hank Paulson, who was Treasury Secretary for President George W. Bush. Before that, he was Chief Executive of the investment bank Goldman Sachs. Secretary Paulson is now heading a unit of the private equity fund TPG Capital that focuses on climate change. He's also chairman and founder of the Paulson Institute. Welcome, Secretary Paulson. Happy Earth Week.
David, it's good to be here with you on Earth Week. Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about this week's big event. On Thursday and Friday, President Biden will host a virtual climate summit from the White House, hopes to gather leaders of as many as 40 nations to talk about climate issues. The talk is that President Biden may announce significant new U.S. commitments to cut emissions as much as 50% from the levels that we emitted in 2005. Based on what you hear, do you think that kind of commitment is likely this week?
Listen, I'm not going to speculate on whether it's likely, but I'm sure there's going to be some kind of a commitment. And let me tell you, he's off to a great start. We're back in the game again, joining Paris right out of the box, and he's already done a number of things that are very, very significant. He said we're going to use federal agencies to set new standards, whether it's for appliances or energy transmission or motor vehicles. He's appointed a terrific new team. You saw John Kerry, but just a really good team across the board. Today, Janet Yellen announced an important climate financing hub at Treasury, headed up by John Morton. So there's a lot that's going on. In his infrastructure bill, it's rich with climate initiatives, and I think the whole world's going to be watching, today to see what the new commitments are, and I think they'll be very important. But as I'll make the point maybe a little bit later when we talk, I think the UN voluntary commitments are necessary, but they're far from sufficient. We're going to need need other mechanisms, global governance mechanisms, if we're going to meet the climate change challenge.
Without asking you to predict what the President Biden will announce, let me ask you, do you think a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 from the 2005 levels, first, is achievable? And second, is it enough in terms of the seriousness of the crisis?
Well, let me tell you, given the seriousness of the crisis, we need to accelerate it. We need to do as much as possible. And is it achievable? Uh, I worked on a study with Mike Bloomberg and Tom Steyer of the Risky Business, looking at the economic impact of climate change and what it would take. And I thought to get to carbon, to get to net zero by 2050, that was a big job, and it's going to involve a lot. It's not just going to involve getting out these, the electrification and the renewables and clean energy. It's going to involve making significant changes in our industrial processes. How we do everything, not just generate electricity and provide transportation, but how we make things, and and manufacturing things like cement and steel and so on. We're going to need big breakthroughs in technologies that either don't exist or are not economically practical. So, but I'd love the aspiration, that's for sure, and I really like some of the areas in which President Biden is proposing we invest.
Let me ask you, Mr. Secretary, how the rest of the world is going to perceive this Earth Day virtual summit. Do you think that the world sees the United States now as back in its role of leadership and commitment on climate change? And part of that question is, how much damage do you think was done to the image of the U.S. during the Trump years when we left the Paris Accords and really disdained these goals?
Well, I think a lot of damage was done, and I don't think it's going to be easy to regain leadership across the board, right? Because I think much of the rest of the world has, lost some of the confidence they had in the U.S. But I'll tell you one thing I do know from talking to leaders around the world and CEOs around the world, they are really glad to see the U.S. back, and they're really hoping and expecting we're able to play a important leadership role. But a big part of that is going to come down to things we do at home, and not just in climate. Not just in climate. Making progress in our political system, our economic system, healing some of the divisiveness we have in our nation. The extreme polarization. So I think we've got a lot of work to do, but and I think that's sort of the big challenge and the big opportunity that President Biden has is again being able to demonstrate leadership abroad and making some of these global sort of the global governance mechanisms work.
Mr. Secretary, you know China as well as any American these days, and I'm interested in your reading of where the U.S. and China are, and first on climate change. We'll talk about some other issues in a minute. But as you know, Secretary Kerry was just in China last week. There was a communique issued Monday that had nice sounding but somewhat vague language saying that two countries are committed to cooperating with each other to tackle the climate crisis. There were no specific commitments, and the Chinese vice minister who'd been involved in the talks said it wasn't realistic to expect China to announce specific commitments yet. How do you read that language, and do you think the U.S. and China are working together on climate for real?
Yeah, I think they are working together for real, but I think there's a lot of work we need to do to get to the place where we have any kind of a constructive relationship here. I think that relationship is as fraught as any I've seen during my time in working with China and working in China. I mean, we are right now competitors. I think the right way to look at it, not just ideologically and economically and in terms of trade and in terms of technology, but across a wide range of areas. And this relationship is going to be fraught for the foreseeable future. And so we're going to have to work together and make progress in areas where we have a common interest. And it just take climate change. China is ground zero when it comes to climate change. 33% of the global emissions come from China. So I can say flat out, we've got no hope of avoiding the worst outcomes if China doesn't make real progress. If China fails, the worst outcomes are going to accelerate. And so now, and to me, it's not as simple as China just saying, well, guess what? We're going to change our voluntary targets. And right now we're saying we're going to peak in 2030 and we're going to be carbon neutral in 2060. Well, let me tell you, China has got a lot of inefficient, big global or manufacturing industries, whether it's cement, steel, petrochemicals. And so they're still heavily reliant on coal. And so they've got these massive problems at home. And then when you look at their involvement on the so-called Belt and Road countries, right, which is a lot of the developing nations in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, their practices outside of China need more work than even those inside China. So there's a lot that needs to be done. That's the negative. The positive is they are farther ahead in making a bigger effort than virtually every other developing nation. And so the models they're developing there in green finance and otherwise are the ones that are going to be very necessary in the developing world. And there's a lot we can do with China. But I don't think we can get started by saying, hey, why don't you accelerate your ambition so you peak before 2030? We need them to peak before 2030, but we need to start working with them on policies and practices to help them get there. And there's a whole series of things we can do to build confidence, and I'm sure hoping we're going to do those. And if anybody knows the way to do that, it's John Kerry.
You used that phrase, more fraught than at any time in your career, speaking about the U.S. China relationship in a speech that you were kind enough to send me this morning. It was strong language. And my question is whether the competition that's clear in the technology sector, and you said in that same speech that you thought some strategic decoupling was inevitable in technology, whether that competition is going to spill over into the climate area, or whether climate can be kept in a separate box, if you will, where both nations in their own and the world's interest pursue that even as they compete in other sectors. What do you think?
David, that is the key question. And right now there has been competition, right? Because China has tariffs on environmental goods and services. And so it makes no sense. They should be working with the United States to reduce tariffs on environmental goods and services. They've been driving down the costs, which has made a big, big difference in renewables and helped China and the whole world. But but they can't view this as just a way to help their own economic situation. So I think this is going to have to be managed, but I think it can be managed because we can clearly find areas where it makes great sense to cooperate. And if we don't cooperate, we're in big trouble. Okay, and so but you've pointed your finger at a meaningful risk. And I don't want to be naive about it, because I would say a big part of what needs to be done is rolling out the technologies which already exist, right, and are commercially viable, and rolling those out very, very quickly and scaling them very quickly. But then a lot has to be done to develop new game-changing technologies. Yeah, as I said, manufacture cement, manufacture steel, you know, jet fuel, how you make manufacturing processes more efficient. And in those areas, I think we need to work with China. We both need to be investing in game changing technologies, and we need to help roll those out and scale in China. And that's going to take some relaxation of, export regulations and other things. And so it is going to take some cooperation.
Mr. Secretary, let me ask for one more insight about China, given your unusual high-level contacts with Chinese leaders. After the Anchorage meeting between Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and their Chinese counterparts, there was concern among some U.S. officials that Chinese President Xi Jinping may have a goal of reunification with Taiwan that's earlier rather than later. In other words, this may be becoming a more immediate concern and potentially problem. What's your reading about the Taiwan situation and how it's seen in Beijing?
Well, I've got to tell you, as I think, David, Taiwan and the territorial issues are very, very important in Beijing. And the three communiques, which were essential to the development of the U.S. China relations, and have basically kept peace in the region and allowed for Taiwan to prosper, have been have worked to date. Now, do I think this is going to be an area of heightened tension and concern? You betcha. Do I think we need to stand by our commitment to Taiwan? Of course we do. But this is something we need to watch very, very carefully, because I think there's a lot of things that China can do to put pressure on Taiwan, short of a military invasion. And they've got a lot of economic levers, and so I think this is, if you wanted to point, we could point to a good number of areas that are flashpoints in terms of national security. And so I think the key to this relationship is how to avoid unnecessary confrontation, because we've seen, in the past, we've seen, we've had plenty of confrontation without healthy competition. And so I think we got to, what I'm trying to focus on, what are the areas where we can have some healthy healthy competition where we can work together. And if we don't figure out how and where we're going to work together, okay, where we're going to compete, and then how to avoid conflict in the areas like the one you just cited, there's going to be real chaos. And we're not going to make progress on climate change, but there's plenty of other issues of global importance we won't make progress on also. And so again, I don't. China is not a revolutionary threat or power. They benefit from a global system. They need stability just like we do. They need peace just like we do. We're going to need some rules of the road for trade and for technology, and we need to make some progress, but it's going to be difficult. But again, climate change is a logical area for us to work, because the Chinese look at it as an economic issue that it is, and I think there's plenty of room for us to make progress there.
Let's turn from China to two other big developing economies, India and Brazil, which are crucial pieces of the climate change puzzle. We're still in a global slowdown caused by the pandemic. Do you think it's going to be harder to get Brazil and India and other countries that are important in this process to make commitments now while the pandemic and the slowdown are continuing?
Let's start with Brazil, because I've spent a lot of time in Latin America, not just China. I set up a Latin American Conservation Council, have done a lot of work around the Amazon, working with the president of Colombia, Ivan Duque, and and as he worked to put together the Leticia Pact, which involved Brazil and the other nations that hold part of the Amazon. And this is critically important. So to step back, big picture, Latin America has been ravaged, absolutely ravaged by the pandemic. When you look at the economic damage and you look at the health damage that's been done, and Brazil has been hit very, very hard. So there's no doubt about that. And these and Bolsonaro is very difficult to work with on these issues. But I actually think you can argue it both ways. But I believe that, and the message that I give all the time, I give to the Brazilians and I give to other Latin American countries, it's going to take a lot of money, a lot of stimulus to build back. And that money, I think there's a much greater chance that money is going to come from foreign investors, and and that it will come from some of the multilateral institutions if you're building back greener. And if you're not, you're going to have trouble getting the financing that you were going to need to build your economies back. And so Brazil is a tough one because it's so hard with Bolsonaro. But there's also in Brazil, there are governors of the key states on the Amazon that I think are more progressive, and I think there's ways in which John Kerry is going to be able to work with key members of Congress there, and we've got a very good ambassador there, and worked to get some of the changes we need. And this is critically important. I'd say, I know that John Kerry is focused on India big time, and India is well behind China and what they're able to do and what they're willing to do. A lot of what happens in India, like the rest of the developing world, is going to center around the way I look at this climate transition. So transitioning from a global economy that is 80% reliant on carbon-based fuels and has been for hundreds of years, to a low carbon or zero carbon economy has got to be the most important, difficult, complex industrial transition that's occurred in history. And so part of this is going to be, how do you get renewables, and make them cheaper? And I know that John Kerry is focused on that in electrification. But a good part of it is going to be also on making advances in all kinds of other industrial processes. And so this is going to play out. There's going to be multiple chapters. Economies are going to evolve. Leading companies are going to evolve. But we have to change. This is hugely difficult, to change the way we not just generate electricity, but how we manufacture things, how we provide transportation, the food we eat. So this is very, very difficult. And I think and so that's why I come back to this global governance, because there's all this focus this week, and rightfully so, on UN and voluntary targets. And everybody talks about them as if they're the be all or the end all. And, and I'm really glad that that President Biden is leading in this area. But these are voluntary targets. We're not on pace to meet those targets. We're not close to being on pace to meet those targets. And even if we did, the world's going to overheat. So I think the other thing, which is going to be much more difficult for the United States to work on with China and other major economies, we need a mechanism that focuses on the big economies, right? you know, the U.S., but China, India, Brazil, the big economies, and deals squarely with the problem of free riding and provides a real incentive to curb emissions.
So, Mr. Secretary, let's talk about the role of business in this transition. You said that you think that business in the U.S. and major global businesses are near a tipping point on climate change. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, here's what I mean, David. I mean that in the last 2 or 3 years, and really the last couple of years, we've seen a number of things that are pushing business to move very quickly here. And I'll tick them off very quickly. First is the dramatic reduction in the cost of renewables. So I'm talking about wind, solar, batteries for performance. They've come down to the fact that in countries with 73% of the world GDP, renewables are lower cost, are competitive when fossil-based fuels, and so that's huge. We've seen great pressure from consumers. I refer to it as the Greta effect, right? We've seen uh, pressure from investors. I call that the Larry Fink effect, but there's the investors are putting much more pressure on companies. Then, so you've seen 2,000 major companies make net zero pledges. Okay, many of them don't have a clue how they're going to get there, but they've made the pledges, and you've seen a the development of a carbon offset market, putting a price on carbon. It's not where it needs to be. It's voluntary, and mandatory. We've got markets in California, New England, and much more advanced markets in Europe, and China is getting ready to develop their own market. So you've seen all that, and then here's the last thing that I think has made the big change, and it's the markets. It has become so clear right now that we are going to be rewiring society to go through this big industrial transition that I've talked about. And so CEOs know it's here to stay, and they know that the markets get there ahead of the revenues and the earnings. And so, of course, there's got to be a bubble when you look at Tesla, but when it's trading at 8 times the market cap of GM, that's sort of reminiscent of what you and I watched with cellular, right? Where you saw the volume, right, with the yellow pages and landlines, and where did the market go to cellular? And so now it's fascinating. I've been calling companies all over the world. And if 3 years ago I talked to them about it, they'd say, sure, climate change is important. And then they would do what you did. They would change it, want to talk about China or whatever, or U.S. politics, or talk to me about their sustainability officer. Now they're focused on this big time, either for offensive reasons, because as we're going through this transition, they see great opportunities for investment, or for defensive reasons. And so what I'm seeing is companies are investing really much more heavily than you would have expected. You're seeing disclosures become more rigorous. 3M hasn't just said we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030. They're going to report every year along the way the math of the path. Honeywell has done something that's very similar. And so again, I think we're at a tipping point. And what this means is, as I look at this industrial, what I call transition, but it's going to be, the next 10 years is going to be very important. And so the key to the next 10 years is going to be rolling out the commercially viable technologies and rolling them out in scale. And what I see as the opportunity there is, in the past, you'd seen a lot of investments in contracted renewables with relatively low returns. You'd seen investments in venture, but standard private equity investments weren't being made because there weren't the big returns that were necessary. And so to me, my punchline here is you're not going to make this transition without private capital. And private sector capital is not going to come in the size and quantity you need it to make a real difference on a concessionary basis. So what it's going to take is to demonstrate that there are plenty of solutions investing in climate technologies that are viable, where it is possible to make an attractive private equity return. And so the reason that I decided, I've been working hard in the public policy area, and I'm going to continue to do that. But I think I'll make a bigger difference if I return to my roots in finance and have a pool of capital. And so the fund that I'm working with, the Rise Climate Fund, is a fund that's going to look to get attractive returns so we can pave the way for other capital to come to roll out these technologies, right? And it's going to measure social impact in terms of carbon emissions avoided. So we'll be able to do both. Now, this is only part of what is required, because it is the important part for the next 10 years, but it's the easier part, as difficult as that is, because we need to continue to invest in these industrial processes. The last point I would make is some of the investments that I've seen that have been the most exciting to me have been one, for instance, called Big River Steel, which TPG invested in, which is the only startup steel company that I can think of being a success in the U.S. in the last 10 or 15 years. It now comprises almost 5% of U.S. steel production, and it's LEED certified because it emits 93% less carbon. So only 7% of the carbon of a normal steel mill. It uses recycled steel and a whole different process. And so that company has now been sold to U.S. Steel, and it's making steel to go into autos. But that's the kind of progress we need to see to get, to really avoid what I see as the worst outcomes.
So, Mr. Secretary, we're out of time. I wish we could continue this for another half hour. It's fascinating to hear you as a prominent former Republican Treasury Secretary working so closely with John Kerry, the special envoy, with President Biden, and really all on the same page. So thank you for helping us kick off Earth Week and our new effort to talk about protecting our planet. Thanks so much for being with us.
David, thank you very much. Good to be with you.
That's all the time we have for today. Please tune in tomorrow at 10 o'clock when my colleague Jonathan Capehart will interview the key player that Secretary Paulson has been talking about, U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change, John Kerry. Please be with us then. Thanks for joining Washington Post Live.